Hello and welcome. The world's focus may be on BP and the Gulf of Mexico, but what about oil spills in poorer countries out of the media spotlight? The BP leak in the Gulf of Mexico is now the biggest oil disaster in US history. So far, anywhere between 80 and 150 million gallons have been pumped out onto the Louisiana coastline, but environmentalists monitoring the oil-rich Niger Delta say that at least 3 times that amount has spilled in the past 50 years, making it the biggest oil spill in history. But that rarely makes the news. Well, people who live there say their land and livelihoods have been ruined, and Amnesty International has singled out the Niger Delta as a human rights disaster. But while BP is set to pay out billions of dollars in compensation in the US, the people of the Niger Delta struggle to get their case heard. Today we ask, could the BP oil spill now bring attention to and accountability to lesser-known disasters around the world? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining me now is Oronto Douglas, a leading human rights lawyer in Nigeria who served in the defense team for the prominent Ogoni leader and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa. Mr. Douglas himself was arrested and tortured by military governments in Nigeria. He now serves as a special advisor to President Goodluck Jonathan, and he joins us from San Francisco. From Strasbourg, we have Geert Riesemer, a lawyer for Friends of the Earth International, which is currently filing a landmark suit against Royal Dutch Shell on behalf of the Niger Delta's farmers. And from Anchorage, we're joined by Riz Steiner, a marine biologist and conservationist who studied and consulted on oil spills around the world. I welcome you all to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Riz.
Pleasure. Mr. Oronto Douglas, if I can start with you, sir. Now, the US President Barack Obama has been very visible, vocally and politically involved in the BP oil spill. But in contrast, Nigeria's president, to whom you're a special advisor, Goodluck Jonathan, has not been that visible when it comes to what's going on in the Niger Delta. And I wonder, considering he's from that part of Nigeria, it's quite noticeable that he's been absent. What plans does he have to be a more visible part of the solution to the issues there?
Well, Riz, as you know, and if you have followed the strategy and tactics of Goodluck Jonathan, as soon as he came into office, he announced 3 priority areas that his government is going to deal with, and that was a few months, about 2-3 months ago. He said that top on the agenda will be electoral reform, with a view to building a democracy that will be responsive and responsible. The second was to look at the whole question of power, energy, and then the third was the Niger Delta. So the Niger Delta is top on the agenda. It's about the third and the most important priority, considering that Nigeria depends on oil, and considering that the last 50 years had been a litany of pollution and pain that had been orchestrated and initiated by transnational companies who defer and respect Western governments where they come from, but had largely ignored our governments and our communities in the Niger Delta and Nigeria as a whole.
Well, let me bring in Geert Riesemer here and ask, to what extent is the BP oil spill starting to highlight similar oil spills and ongoing issues in other parts of the world? Has it brought this to a public attention that really has been missing until now?
Yes, I think you can say so. I think it's striking that whereas in the Gulf of Mexico, people already half of the people affected by this oil spill have been compensated, whereas at the same time in Nigeria, farmers are already waiting 5-10 years and haven't seen a cent. People around the world are starting to understand that this is a double standard that needs to be tackled somehow, and it's an urgent problem. I think, adding to what Mr. Douglas said, I think also the oil companies have their own responsibility. They can't just rely on the government, but Shell is already, for example, operating in the Niger Delta for 50 years now. And what we have seen in those 50 years is that they have done nothing to clean up, for example, pollution sites. It's all lying there. It's polluted the water, it's polluted the land. People cannot fish anymore. So it's a big issue, and I really hope that the spill in the Gulf of Mexico will also put the spotlights on companies like Shell and force them to take their responsibility.
Well, Rick Steiner, you've studied oil spills around the world. Give us a comparison of what happened with BP in the latest spill and what's been going on, for example, with the Niger Delta. A comparison of really how the two are equivalent or perhaps very different.
Well, there are similarities to all spills and also unique components to all spills as well. The Niger Delta has been severely polluted in a chronic way for the last 5 decades. We've studied this several times there on the Delta, and we have concluded that it's one of the most severely petroleum damaged ecosystems and human systems anywhere in the world. In contrast to that, a lot of the attention that the U.S. public is paying right now is to the Gulf spill, and that's appropriate. But what is inappropriate is the hypocritical lack of attention to importing 1 million barrels or so of oil a day from the Niger Delta for the last several decades and paying the social and environmental and economic costs of that absolutely no attention whatsoever. So there are a few silver linings, hopefully, in the Gulf spill, the BP spill, and hopefully one of them is it will help us all, the public, understand the true costs of oil, which include chronic oil spills in places like Nigeria, wars fought in the Middle East to secure oil supplies, climate change, health impacts, breathing emissions, and these catastrophic oil spills that continue to occur regularly.
Now, looking back at the Niger Delta, Oronto Douglas, according to government figures, Nigeria suffered more than 6,800 oil spills through to 2001, losing around 130 million gallons. That's 3 million barrels. It's something that's been kept very much out of the news. I wonder why we haven't heard much about that. And given that 80% of Nigeria's revenues come from gas and oil, what reluctance do you think there is to address the issue at a government level? Of course, Mr. Jonathan has only been in office for a matter of months, but what kind of pressure is he going to face, considering the large dependency on oil and gas, to not make too much of a point of this?
So the hidden figures is as a result of our leprous history of dictatorship, and we've had series of successive military dictators who had always worked with the oil companies to deny the communities and peoples of the Niger Delta their right to life. Now, the president, with this sort of information, has a responsibility to respond. And in responding, he is feeling that from the Gulf of Guinea to the Gulf of Mexico, from Bayelsa to Florida, there is the urgent need for government to respond and respond effectively to ensure that whatever happens to the land, to the air, to the waters of the peoples of the Niger Delta does not affect the generation of the now and the tomorrow. And government, I believe, is responsive now, but the transnational companies who are so powerful and so domineering, they respect their home governments. Look at the response of BP in the Gulf of Mexico spill, to the responses that Shell, Egypt, Chevron, and the rest are having in places like Nigeria. This has to be stemmed, and the only way to do that is to ensure that the power of our democracy resides in the community and the country and citizens. And Mr. President is keen on ensuring, through the electoral processes and reform going on, to return power to the people so that the people can hold these companies accountable.
Now, one thing we did try to do is get a representative from Shell to give us the company's perspective firsthand, and we were unable to. But Shell International has released a fairly lengthy response to the arguments put forward against it, and here's part of that response. It says, the Shell defendants refute liability for the identified spills, all of which have been caused by sabotage or unauthorized third-party interference. And it goes on to say, cleanup and remediation have been completed in accordance with applicable requirements and have been certified by relevant government agencies. Gedrisima, let me ask you what you know about the sabotage and unauthorized third-party interference being blamed on the spills by Shell.
Well, I think what Shell is clearly trying to do is to blame everything on sabotage, which relieves them from paying compensation. That's why they're saying this. To get away and not being held responsible. Of course, there's sabotage in Nigeria. Everybody knows that, and we also acknowledge that. We are the first to acknowledge that. However, there's a substantial part of the oil spillages which are a result of poor maintenance. Now, recently I've traveled in Nigeria myself, and I've seen in those villages where there are pipelines laying there since 1970, which are really, they're eroded pipelines. So there is really a number of percentage, a considerable percentage of these leakages caused by poor maintenance. And Shell is trying to hide this behind the curtain of sabotage. And again, this confirms the picture we have of this company trying to avoid for taking any form of responsibility for the damage they cause and blame it on others. Now that's why we have said, together with 4 farmers from the Niger Delta, this is no longer acceptable. We are taking Shell to court in the Netherlands, so in its own backyard, and we are claiming 3 things. First, that they should start maintaining better their pipelines. Secondly, that they clean up in a number of areas the spills properly, so that means not dig a hole and throw everything in there, but really clean the environment, which they haven't done so far. And the third demand is that we want financial compensation for the farmers.
Let's get a call in from California. We have Neda on the line. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, sir. Great show. Thank you very much. My question is to your honorable distinguished guest, is that don't you think that in the United States we have this opportunity because of the media that they are pushing so hard on BP? If we had this opportunity in the other part of the world that the media were able to push on the BP, then they will do the same that they are doing.
A good point. Let me get that to Riz Steiner. I mean, is this an opportunity to mobilize people to insist on action being taken? Is this a chance for a much more grassroots awareness campaign and maybe more positive action?
Absolutely. I think it's, for the Niger Delta, it's really now or never. And let's hope it's now. The problems are manifold. There are so many. People generally throw their hands up when they hear Niger Delta and say it's an unsolvable mess. There's no way we can fix it. That isn't true. It is a difficult, complex problem. But the companies, as Geert was mentioning, have to put in best available technology. They have to maintain their infrastructure. The government, as Oronto was mentioning, needs to do its job on behalf of the people. And part of the dynamic there is the government is a majority owner with the transnational oil companies of all the oil projects. So it's both the regulator and the financial beneficiary of the oil development. And that's a contradictory role. And it's been too far on the give us the money side. And plus, there's been a long, legendary history of corruption, both in the states and, to some extent, in the federal government. The most exciting thing that's happened in years for the Niger Delta, I think, is that Goodluck Jonathan, who's from the Delta, is now the president of Nigeria, and he had the foresight to appoint somebody like Oronto Douglas as his advisor for the Delta. I had recommended years ago that the United Nations convene a Niger Delta Reconciliation and Restoration Commission, independent of the government, independent of the companies, to resolve the claims of the Delta, restore the ecosystem, and point a path forward to sustainability there. We haven't gotten there, but I would love to have the support of President Jonathan in calling for the UN to establish such a commission.
Now, we've got to take a very short break here, but we're back with more of this discussion before, as we go, we'll leave you with scenes from a Friends of the Earth documentary on challenges facing the Niger Delta. It's called The People of Nigeria versus Shell.
The human right is dying off. Like myself, I feel I should feed up, I should have enough food for myself and my family before this time, with all I have invested. But Shell has made it all gone.
The only way I survive will have been this fish ponds, which I inherited from my late father. And now that the full fish pond is damaged, I'm feeding from hand to mouth. That's a daily basis. Either I go to bush or job or 500 naira a day. That is what I use in feeding. So you cannot see that I cannot meet up the demands of life again. The only source which I will have survived has been damaged by this oil pollution.
Welcome back. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico has been given a huge amount of media attention and will cost the oil giant billions of dollars in cleanup and pending compensation fees. Across the world, in the largely unreported Niger Delta, equally serious oil damage has been going on for half a century. And we're discussing that with leading Nigerian human rights lawyer Oronto Douglas, who now is an advisor to President Goodluck Jonathan. Also, Geert, a lawyer for Friends of the Earth International, which is currently filing a landmark suit against Royal Dutch Shell on behalf of farmers living in the Niger Delta. We also have Riz Steiner, a marine biologist and advisor on handling oil spills around the world. A couple of comments we had by email from guests, one from Stacey Ali in the UK, saying the spill in the Gulf of Mexico should send a message to governments of the developing world, like Nigeria, to take action. Also one from Barnabas Mavuti, a regular viewer, who wrote in saying the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta have been losing their productive land to oil spills for years. Now that a similar disaster has happened in the US, it's news. We're also joined on the line by Oliver in Virginia, who's been waiting patiently. Oliver, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Riz. My question is, what is the comparison between the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and the oil spill in the Niger Delta? Because the other one, in the Gulf of Mexico, was caused by the mismanagement of BP, while the other one is caused by a civil war between Christian and Muslims over there in Nigeria for the last 20 years that is lasting until today. So I think there is no comparison between those two catastrophes.
Let me get a response from our guest, starting with Toronto Douglas. Do you see that kind of difference between the two situations?
There is the situation has nothing to do with Muslims and Christians fighting in Nigeria, I must say. The situation has to do largely with transnational companies not responsible and not responsive to the issues concerning the protection of the environment, respect for the culture of the people. It has to do with our history of military dictatorship and governments at the federal level and at the state level, where they do not take responsibility for defending their own people. Right now, we are in a democracy. We are building our democracy, and it is important that government respond to the needs and the wishes of the people. It has nothing, again, it has nothing to do with Muslims and Christians fighting in the last 20 years. The Niger Delta, as you all know, is largely a Christian community with other people also related to traditional worship. And it is important that we do not impute religious undertone into what is happening in the Delta. Okay. It is economic, it is governance, it is essentially responsibility and responsiveness of the transnational company that ought to do what is right, and they are not doing it.
Now, Riz Steiner, I saw you were also shaking your head to that comment by our guest, but our viewer. Also, one thing that I know in the past when interviewing Shell about this, they've tended to defend their position, saying, look, Shell actually puts a lot into the infrastructure in places like Ogoniland in terms of building schools and hospitals, where the Nigerian government has failed to do that, has failed to provide the governance I think Toronto Douglas is referring to there. When you look at the upside and the downside when it comes to what the communities get, do you see any upside from Shell's presence there?
No. Unfortunately, you see all of the costs, environmental and social and economic costs, being borne by the local people, of which there's something like 30 million of the most desperately poor people in the world living within the Niger Delta. And basically the problem has been the transnational oil companies have had a double standard. They have put a system in place there which is as cheap as possible, as cheap as they thought they could get away with, and they have. The government, both the federal and the state governments in Nigeria, have been dysfunctional. There has been inadequate governance and oversight of this, and that system, the losers have been the environment of the Delta and the people who live there. And for the United States, for instance, to import 1 million barrels a day from the Niger Delta without paying any attention whatsoever to the exported social and environmental costs of that sort of consumption, well, I think the era of that sort of ignorance has to come to an end here. And that's what I hope this event will help catalyze, that we know our consumption of energy and materials causes environmental and social consequences, whether it's produced in the country or from overseas. And we've got to start paying attention to those costs, even in the Niger Delta.
Okay, another caller on the line from Maryland this time. Ebenezer, thanks for your call. What would you like to ask or say?
Yes, I want to ask the land lawyer. I know him personally. Having Goodluck Jonathan as president doesn't actually resolve the issue of the Niger Delta, though he comes from that area. So the problem of the Niger Delta and that of the United States, the oil spill, is all an issue of greed from the multinational corporations. Okay. The question I want to ask is simple. Now, why can't the government of Nigeria realize that having a citizen of the Niger Delta becoming president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria is not resolving the economic situation of the people down there, which is being caused by shale.
Okay, let me get a quick response from Oronto Douglas to that.
Well, Jonathan is just about 3 months old in government. Like I said with my opening statements, there are 3 priority areas that he is focusing on: power, electoral reform, and the Niger Delta. Now, it is the responsibility of Nigerians to quickly realize that resolving the Niger Delta question is important to Nigeria's advancement, development, and continuous progress. And it is at this point that the key issues regarding energy, for example, if we must have electricity, the Niger Delta has to be stable. If we must have our electoral reform in place, the Niger Delta must smile. These are the issues, and Goodluck Jonathan is acutely aware of that, and it is important that he's encouraged to ensure that it delivers on the promises to the people of Nigeria.
Now, Gidrisum, I have about 40 seconds. I want to get your response to your optimism when it comes to the kind of legal action you've taken. Do you really expect a big multinational corporation such as Shell to be ultimately accountable for what's happening?
Well, I think that can happen if we continue our campaigns, and we definitely will. But also there is a role for the Nigerian government, and I think we should give President Jonathan the benefit of the doubt, but we definitely want to see some action from his side, and he is and one of the things, for example, he could do now is stand firm on the petroleum industries bill, which is being introduced in Nigeria. Is going to be hopefully adopted. Shell has already said they will leave the country if that law is adopted.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you there. We're out of time, I'm sorry. But thank you all for being with us, gentlemen. Remember, you can watch a podcast of the show on iTunes. This week, a story of detention, torture, and a tough battle in the U.S. courts. Syrian-American Maher Arar explains his 8-year fight to clear his name in America after being wrongly deported and tortured as a suspected terrorist. On the next show, tensions between Israel and the U.S. are now in focus, but what about Israel's soured relationship with Turkey? What impact will the changing dynamics have on prospects for peace in the region? Be sure to tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.